I'm Melanie Swayze, a global real estate advisor with Gibson Sotheby's based in Metro Boston. I closely advise homebuyers and sellers of all stages of life, guiding them to intelligent, winning decisions.
I'm Derek Lumpkins, a real estate investor with a background in community organizing. I also enhance equity and inclusion initiatives at companies and organizations, and I guide leaders through executive coaching.
When we get together, we dive into the intersections of culture, class, mindset, and Black freedom.
Welcome to the Blacklining Forum,
a podcast about Black wealth, power, and land.
Hey, good morning, Miss Melanie.
Mr. Lumpkins.
How you doing today?
Wonderful. Your shirt is an inspiration.
Inspiration.
I love it.
Okay.
And an invitation.
I call it my coffee bean shirt. I mean, I didn't get it anywhere special. I just got it at, one of those big chain stores in Barcelona. I think right after you left. I don't remember getting it when you were still visiting. But I was like, yeah, I like this. It's different. So every so often I'll wear it.
Yes, you're wearing it.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to ask you a different question than I usually ask you. Normally I ask you, how are you? And then you tell me, I'm happy to be alive. And, then we have our usual thing. So I'm going to ask you a different question.
Okay.
Have you seen something unusual lately?
Oh, I love the question. I've seen things remarkable. I don't know that I've seen things unusual. I'm really scanning.
I mean, it wasn't meant to be a trick question. It was just an actual legit question. Like, have you seen something unusual? It doesn't have to be big. It can be something small. Maybe you saw a dog wearing a tutu or something. I don't know.
I really want to give us something, but I can't think of anything unusual at the moment. That was it?
Yeah, that was it. Just something unusual. Because, people who listen and watch us regularly will always hear us ask the same questions. So, have you seen something unusual?
Well, I hear that tonight we're going to have a super moon. So, and not only that it will be probably the only time in our lifetimes that you will also be able to see Saturn alongside this super moon.
Okay.
So that sounds profound. And I'll borrow from a friend's unusual. A friend, I think they were on the Cape recently. They were somewhere where someone had a telescope that they were able to look into, and they actually saw Saturn. They saw the rings around Saturn, where you're like, oh my God, like the coloring books, like the cartoons growing up, there's really rings around Saturn. So yeah, to my mind, that's like, whoa.
I have looked through a telescope once, and I saw it must have been Saturn. I saw rings, and I had that same moment of awe. I was like, wow, it's real. Like what they tell us is true.
Sometimes.
Well, we won't get there just yet. One step at a time. One step at a time. So for me, something unusual I saw. Those living walls, those walls that are like usually have moss or lichens on them.
Yes,
and just,
love.
People grow plants.
And Barcelona has that kind of thing.
It does. But I've seen them in New York. I've seen them in Boston.
Definitely.
I've seen them, a bunch of cities. I was in a supermarket recently, big chain supermarket. I saw that particular wall was taller than a normal store. It's like maybe almost 2 stories high. So it was about 20 feet. And for our metric friends out there, it's about 6 meters tall. And then it's like the equivalent length. So it's like this big square that's like 20 by 20 or 6 meters by 6 meters, completely dead. And I'm like, wait a minute. A supermarket, a place that is dedicated to supplying like fresh produce.
For our vitality.
Exactly. And I'm like, it was completely dead. And this wasn't just like moss or lichens. These were like, the type of house plants that kind of form like vines.
Mm-hmm.
And so like out of this enormous wall, there was like one little light green vine, and the rest were like dark green, brown, gray, or black. And I was like, how do they and this is right by the checkout counter. So I'm like, how do they even let it get to this? And, I was like, okay, this is really bad. This is really, really bad. But then, my mind sort of started to like wander, and I started thinking, this is actually not a bad metaphor for where we are now. Because then I started thinking, well, walls hold up structures. Walls also shape our experiences. They shape where we go, how we get there, if we can get to a place. They can also be decorative. They can be designed. So if you think of a wall, like from architect Zara, I think it's Zara Hadidi. I think that's her name,
Yeah.
Zara Hadidi. Or a Guggenheim wall, it's very rounded and sculptural, depending upon where it is. Walls have this way of like inspiring us or containing us, constraining us. And so when I saw this dead wall, this dead living wall, I was sort of like, this is a metaphor. Like structure is not supporting life. Structure is not supporting life. And at the same time, it is an opportunity to replace what is there with something new, to add new seeds, to add new life, to spark new imaginations with whatever they put in there, because maybe they'll put in something red or something purple or something, whatever, something that flowers. And I was like, this is something that I think really speaks as a metaphor for where we are now. And I think could be a good way of setting up today's conversation.
Do tell us how this links us to today's conversation.
So when I was thinking about walls and structure, and then how the structure supports life, we're at a point now where the life on the structure is either being strangled, it's not being nourished. And people are questioning, is this the structure that we should be growing on? Is this the structure that we should be trying to survive on? And because the structure is still shaping our experiences, it's still shaping how we think, how we speak, who we interact with. Is the wall dividing us? Is the wall channeling us into a certain direction?
Yeah.
And so I was thinking, okay, there's a structure here. There's life dying on this wall, or being strangled, or not being nurtured. And perhaps this is an opportunity to really start thinking about, okay, if we still have to have some element of structure, we have to have some structure. Otherwise, it's anarchy. We need some element of structure. But what life are we going to grow upon this structure? How will we nurture it? And what will it look like? That's kind of where my mind went when I sort of went from that supermarket to this conversation.
Yes, thank you. That's helpful. Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, I mean, just to contend with the fact that, yes, we do require structure and structures, but how do we relate to them in a way that continues to nurture vitality? I love it. I do believe our guest can shed light on that for us today. Yeah.
I believe so.
Okay. Well, let's invite our guest in. Today, we are going to be speaking with Joris Lechêne. He's a trainer in decoloniality. He draws from his lived experiences as Black, queer, neurodivergent, and his practice of sociology to explore the parallels between all forms of oppression. Joris has lived and worked in 5 countries and on 3 continents in both Black and white dominant societies. As an educator and social commentator on social media, Joris specializes in making the implicit explicit.
Ooh.
Let's go.
Hello.
Welcome. Welcome.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you. And I was listening in to the conversations you were having, and I was getting all fidgety on my chair because I'm like, yes, I have something to say about it. I can think of many ways. It just so happens that I recently submitted a project about analyzing walls in my hometown of Basse-Terre in Guadeloupe, in the Caribbean, and it's a very colonial and colonized city. It's the colonial capital of the island, and it's full of walls. There's walls everywhere because walls of all of the administration, the monumental, all the monuments, the administrative buildings, they're all surrounded by walls. The gardens, walls, and it's something that is not very usual, but you can really tell from the abundance of walls that this is a city that was built initially at a time where people, the majority of people, namely Black people, were not supposed to walk around and to be free of their movements. And you can see it in the way that the city is organized. And you were saying something about walls. That walls don't necessarily have to be oppressive, and that reminded me of the case of this city in Mali, in Djenné. There's historic walls that are made with earth, and they are built to be actually quite fragile, and that means that every year all of the residents, all of the community comes together to rebuild the wall and to add an extra layer to consolidate it after the rainy season or before the rainy season. But once a year, either after or before the rainy season, the whole community comes together, and that's designed into the wall because the wall has those logs, those wooden, it's basically scaffolding, but that is part of the structure, so that every year people can climb it and add. So it's a good example of a wall that is not here to divide, to oppress, but that is actually a vehicle of connection and socialization. And I think that unfortunately we don't have much of that in our society. But yes, walls in themselves don't have to be bad.
Yes.
Or limiting. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. So let's take a step back, because Melanie gave a great introduction talking about how you've been on 5 continents, no, three continents and 5 countries, or 5 continents and 3 countries. And you said you're from Guadeloupe, and then you talked about Mali. We're looking at you now. So for those who are just listening but not watching, we see a map of the London Tube behind you. So there's lots of movements, lots of walls, lots of, history here. So can you do just a quick connection of all those things? So from Guadeloupe to London, and maybe some of the other things, and then how you got into decoloniality and what that is.
All right. Well, yeah, I was initially born in the northeast of France, in Strasbourg. Very white, very and I grew up in Guadeloupe. It's a French island in the Caribbean. So we are black. We are a black culture, but there's a lot of French in us as well. And so we exist in that tension. For those in your audience who are familiar with Caribbean identity in general, it's always like kind of on the fence between, but still being part of the sphere of the former colonizer, cultural, economic sphere, but at the same time being black nations and Afro-descendant nations far from Africa. And plus, you add the mix of some Indian cultures or other cultures, Asian cultures as well. So that's the kind of Caribbean mix. I grew up there, and then I lived in France. I was back in France for a little while. After that, I studied architecture. So my background is in architecture, but I'm a proud college dropout, as you would say. Well, to not make a reference to a bad person, but yes, I'm a university dropout, to make it more in the context of the UK. And so I studied architecture in France, and then in Portugal. I spent a couple of years in Portugal. And after that, I moved to London, and I've been in London for 15 years. I now have British citizenship, and hence my accent, I guess. And yes, and also since 2020, the BLM uprising, I have been delivering workshops on racism, bias, privilege, decoloniality, because yes, that was the moment where most of British universities realized that, racism is a thing. So suddenly there was a demand, and I'm sure it was pretty much the same in the US as well. There was suddenly an interest in anti-racism. So I worked mostly with British universities, but I don't know if you've heard, all universities seem to have resolved racism since then, or at least that's what you would believe if you look at my bookings, because I am not busy right now. I'm not working. I'm not delivering many workshops. And unfortunately, it was all just a flash in the pan, and it was just a very performative thing, as we can see now with what is happening to Black people, mostly in the US, or immigrants and people of color. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, go ahead, Melanie.
I was just thinking, what an arc. Thank you for laying out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if I landed where you expected me to land, but yeah.
We
It's
don't
where we
often
are.
know where we're going. So, it's fine where you take us. It's fine where you take us.
Mhm.
So you mentioned Portugal, you mentioned France, you mentioned the UK. And when we had our preliminary conversation with you, we were talking about being in the centers of empire, whether
Yes.
past or present. So you've been in three. I've spent time in Spain, in London, and in Japan. So I've been in three as well. Melanie, I don't know. Are there any empires where you'd say you've been?
Well, my family is from the Caribbean. I've spent periods, like months-long periods, in Jamaica, and well, when I would say the seat of empire, I've also spent months living in Rome, and actually in that context, thinking about southern Italy in particular, and actually there is a almost colonial kind of relationship between the north and the south in Italy. So yeah, I've had a chance to reflect and experience these dynamics in different places as well.
Mm-hmm. So as we begin walking into this conversation around decoloniality,
Yes.
Joris, could you sort of explain to us what coloniality is and what decoloniality is, and why decoloniality is something people today should start thinking about?
Absolutely. Well, so you've heard me mention already doing workshops on anti-racism, on bias, on privilege. And this whole time that I've been working on those topics and delivering workshops on those topics, I've always been looking for something that would explain all of those dynamics, all of the dynamics of inequality, of dehumanization, of extraction. And me and my colleagues, we have landed on the idea that coloniality actually explains it covers all of the other forms of oppression that we often talk about when we talk about capitalism, the patriarchy, racism, white supremacy. All of those systems, they can be, I believe, accurately described if we describe them along the lines of coloniality. Now, what is coloniality? There's a difference between coloniality and colonization. So colonization is the physical invasion and the putting in place structures of power to colonize people, territories, etc. Coloniality is broader than that, because if you remove the colonizer, you no longer have colonization. However, you still have coloniality, because coloniality is the society that we live in. It's the mindset, is the set of mindsets that even allowed for colonization to happen to begin with. And it's a certain way of viewing the world in terms of hierarchies and in terms of extraction. So it's all about power. Do I have power over you? If I do, then how will I extract what I need from you? And if you have power over me, then you will extract from me. And this mentality, which is the way I'm saying it now, it might sound to your audience that, well, this is the way that, the universe works, and this is how humanity has always worked. It's eat or be eaten. It's always survival of the fittest. So what are you talking about? But actually, it's not. And that's the point that I think is very important, and that many people still really struggle with, is that it's not the general rule. It's not a universal rule, because if we look at the way that indigeneity, for instance, people who exist outside of coloniality exist, there are other ways of creating society that is not based on power, exploitation, extraction, and dominance. There are ways that focus more on relationality, relationships between members of the community, but also relationship with the land, relationship with nature, relationship with life, relationship with cosmology, ancestrality. And so we have entire civilizations that have always existed and that still exist, and that are much more based on the importance of connection, and where you define yourself not by who you have power over or the amount of power that you have, and but more you're defined by who you are connected to, and in what way you are connected. So the quality of those connections. So that would be indigeneity. And then going back to what coloniality is, again, so it's the set of it's the mindset, it's but it's also the practice of creating societies that are based on exploitation, oppression, domination, and hierarchies of being, suppression of the humanity of those who are being exploited. So that is what coloniality is, or at least that's the concept, my understanding of it, and my working theory.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was a lot. Yes. So I want to take some examples. Let's take 2020 specifically, because 2020, I think, is a time when a lot was going on. And maybe you can say, well, this does fall into decoloniality, or this doesn't, or this is sort of like a transitionary point. So when I think of 2020, I think of 2020 and 2021. I think of the toppling of some of the statues of Confederate people in the US. And there were some, I think, colonial people in the UK and France and some other places.
Yep.
There were also the Black Lives Matters protests, which you referred to. And I feel like there was something else. I can't remember exactly what, but at least those two stick out in my mind as two very concrete things that happened in 2020 and 2021 that may sort of touch upon some aspects of decoloniality, because I feel like with some of the Black Lives Matters protests and focus, they were focused more on community and engagement and redistribution of resources in different ways. And so are either of those, sort of the dismantling and toppling of some of the imagery and that push towards the redistribution of resources and information and systems, are either of those parts or aspects of decoloniality, or are they sort of touching upon it, or like, where would you say that kind of begins and sort of flows into?
Right. So you're making me realize that I explained what coloniality was, but not what decoloniality is. But so I'm getting there now with your question. And what happened in 2020 was first a civil uprising because of racism and racial tensions. So in that context, racism is a tool of oppression. Racism in the context of white supremacy, those are systems that are the product of coloniality. I think that's quite obvious, right? Because, well, colonization, slavery, all of that are built on the dehumanization and exploitation of Black people historically. So this is as colonial as it gets. So what happened in 2020 is that there was suddenly a realization, racism is a thing, and maybe let's do something about it. And there was another thing that kind of went in the direction of a potential for a decolonial awakening, but I'm going to explain later that I don't think it actually happened. But the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, that forced people to rethink how they organize society, how they socialize with people, because suddenly it was not so easy to make connections, or you had to also reconsider the way that you occupy the territory, because using your car, you were not as free to move as you used to be. So there was an opportunity to go back to the roots of creating connections with our community, with our families, with our household. And there was quite a lot of movement in that direction. So the things that were happening in 2020, 2021 were a rise in awareness of racism, the racist history of the West, and an appetite for community and for creating new ways of socializing, of creating connections. So those were the big opportunities. But as I've said earlier, this was a flash in a pan, because one of the characteristics of the society that we live in, of capitalism, and more specifically neoliberalism, is that it's really good at co-opting and appropriating anything that looks like progressive movements and liberation movements, and it repackages it and sells you it in a way that is not going to challenge the system. And that's exactly what happened with anti-racism. We saw all of those anti-racism talks and all of the workshops that I delivered and all of the good intentions that we saw and all of those black squares posted on Instagram back in 2020. What of them now? What's left of it? Nothing. Because not only have we gone back, but we've gone back with a vengeance. Like we are paying the price of having dared to believe in a society that could be less racist, that could be more equal, more human. The backlash is actually stronger than the initial reaction. And I believe that this is what we're paying the price of now. And that is, we kind of caught a glimpse of what a society could look like, what a decolonial society could look like. But the current system is now punishing us for having had the aspiration, for daring to believe in this kind of society. So in a sense, that validates the fact that this is the way to liberation, that utopian society that we are thinking of, a decolonial society, where we think in terms of connection, where we stop thinking in terms of oppression and exploitation and extraction. That is telling us that this is the way forward, but at the same time, the people who benefit from the status quo remaining the way it is, they also noticed it, and they are working harder now to maintain things the way they are.
That's such an interesting perspective. That's such an astute way of putting it. Like, we now know that that's the way forward. Like, we now know that that's the way forward. I guess there's nothing more to say, but now we know. Okay.
But they know it too. The people who don't want us to go that way, they know it too. But they're more organized. They have more power, obviously. So this is what we get. We get the Trump administration, but I would put the Biden administration prior to that, also in a very colonial context. And we have who we have in the UK as well. I mean, it's a global thing. It's a global backlash, which is a good sign in a sense, because this is the sign of an empire falling. We are experiencing collapse of society. And so it's the sign that it's the end, but it would be dangerous to think that it's not gonna go down without a fight. Unfortunately, the fact that the end of this current system is near, that also means that things are going to get worse. Unfortunately, I believe, or at least this is not the end of the suffering. We're not at the end of the tunnel yet. So I try to balance out. I try to stay positive by thinking that all of what we're experiencing now, those are the signs of empire falling. But that also means that empire, in the meantime, is going to become more and more violent, more and more erratic. And people are going to suffer.
Yeah. I wonder if human societies actually have had the experience of empire falling, right? I know that you think about the Roman Empire, that no longer exists in that way. But like, have we actually experienced that, actually? Because I'm hearing everything you're saying, Joris, and I agree. And I also think, as much as people might have had intellectual, psychological, emotional, spiritual, even awakenings during that period where we were across the globe flatlined, and in many ways brought on the same level, no matter what, in order to come back, whatever back is, we had to remerge into the flow of the economic system. There's no way around it. And in fact, things became tighter because of the fact that there had been a flat line, right? So it's that much more important for people to have a job, right? It's like, and not because there's a way that capitalism can confuse us to believe that we have autonomy that we don't have. So, for example, work from home became like just a sign of this is what it means to do good business, until now that's starting to recoil and turn back on itself. But even in the instance of that, like people, because of the inflationary response to the pandemic, people have to work that much harder to make basic amounts of money to survive or try to thrive. So I hear you and I agree that there is a collapse. I don't know that we can tell that we're on a liberatory path because of all the constraints and all the strains. Like our dollars don't go as far. And so across the spectrum of class, that's going to impact people differently. People in the Northeast and people in the Northeast who happen to be high income earners, a high net worth households, they aren't frightened, right? Necessarily yet. They don't feel that there's a collapse necessarily yet. But you also have folks on the other end of the economic spectrum who are very clear that things are collapsing. And that's then why they are more responsive to messages from the news packaged to confuse us all that, you know what, government is not for me, we're out for ourselves, right? So we're all being manipulated, influenced by the fact that things are that much tighter, that much more tenuous. And that's why we are susceptible to what's happening at the governmental level and don't have a kind of grip on it. So, okay, that's good to acknowledge. Like, oh, wow, stuff's getting real messy. That does probably mean we need to rebuild governmental systems. I guess what I'm saying is just because people had an opening didn't actually mean there was true opening. Like things actually need to come apart. Things need to come apart. One of the things we didn't mention that was happening during the pandemic, I think happened broadly around the world, is we started to relate to the natural world again. People got outside, people could see what the air was like in some countries without smog for the first time in decades or generations, right? So it's that, I think it's that level of things needing to be undone. I don't think we've seen that yet. And so I'm still trying to understand. I don't want this to just be an intellectual conversation about the falling of empire. We're, you know, like it's easy on the left to talk about the collapse of capitalism. Yes, things are definitely collapsing, but they're shoring back up, right? It's like people who are invested in the stock market are feeling quite fine. And that's absurd. It's extreme. It is tenuous. It is bizarre, right? That people are thriving in the stock market, but other people are lining up at food pantries, right? But where in there do we understand how to build a relationality? That's what I am curious about. If decoloniality is about, it equals relationality, how do we do it? And that relationality can't just be on the human level. It has to be about the quote unquote resource, because we're all extracting and abusing resource. So, you know, like, especially in the face of AI, because that's our next battle. That's our next sort of dragon that we're, you know, we're in the shadow of, is AI is taking over. That's on a resource level. That's on an electric level. It's going to mess up the environment in more extreme ways. And we're also increasingly dependent on it because that's what it means to progress. And so you had said to us in our initial conversation, something that's really stuck with me. I was so delighted to have that initial conversation with you, where you talked about us being obsessed. I think you said obsessed or addicted to power. And we don't know how not to be. So that's all I'm saying. It's like you come out of the pandemic, it's like, we want to get back to this. We want this on our terms. We want this on our terms. We want this on our terms. All of that thrust of getting what we want is about individual power. We don't know how to think outside of that. And so that's why I'm like, here's pressure on you, Joris, but I want you to help us think about what decoloniality means to actually reconstruct our desires and what we think is progress and what we think is connection.
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack here. first you were saying that you don't think that we are on the path to liberation, and yeah, I didn't say that. Unfortunately, we're definitely not. And that's the thing. Society collapsing, empire falling, that doesn't mean there's no automatic, that doesn't mean that means we're free just by the virtue of society collapsing and all of the systems of oppression collapsing. That no, history tells us that it doesn't happen that way. Most of the revolutions, if you look at all of the revolutions that's happened, what it really was, it was a change in the people who got to decide, who got the power. But that's essentially that's what it always boiled down to. So yeah, definitely we can't just wait, just watch society collapse hoping that it doesn't affect us and see what's going to happen next. No, there has to be, whilst all of the things are falling apart, there also has to be an organization and an intention to build something, because if we let it happen naturally, we're not going to be happy with whatever's coming next. It's not going to be better than this. It's just going to be a different form of oppression. So that's the first thing. And then you were asking about if that's the first time that we're seeing empires collapse. And again, that's a bit depressing, but this is not the first time that an empire collapses. But what the essence of what we talk about when we talk about coloniality is that this is the first time in human history that a colonizing project, a project of colonization, has been so total, so successful, and so global. Because if you look at
beyond, because you think about the British Empire, at some point Britain owned, I don't know if it was 80% of the planet or something.
Yeah.
But we still see the long tail of that.
Yeah. And if you look at the Roman Empire, yeah, the Roman Empire was powerful and everything, but it was not the only system that existed in the world. Whereas if you look at coloniality, and that's what we mean when we talk about coloniality, it's that it's a global thing. So when we talk about separate, different colonizations, you know, the British Empire, the French Empire, they were all their own separate empire, but they still operated under this bigger empire, which we're still dealing with now, which is coloniality. And that's when, you know, when you hear people, usually racist people, saying that, oh yeah, but Arabs, they also colonized, and Black people also colonized, and, you know, all there has been colonial projects throughout history. There have been efforts, projects, wars that we can describe as colonial wars. However, what is unique about the one that we still live under now is that it succeeded. It succeeded in literally colonizing the entire planet. There isn't a single border on Earth that hasn't been designed and created by the result of Western European imperial coloniality. There isn't a single person on this planet who doesn't completely, who lives completely outside of capitalism. There, even, you know, if you look at North Korea, it's still a country, even if they claim to not be capitalism, but they still have to operate in a context where, you know, it still has money and all of those things. So it's still under capitalism. So when you look at, if you listen to some indigenous thinkers, and I'm thinking more specifically in Brazil, because I do a lot of work with the indigeneity in Brazil, and people like Ailton Krenak, for instance, they will talk about the monoculture. They will define coloniality as a monoculture. Yes, we may have different cultures around the world, but coloniality is a culture in itself. We all live under the same mentality of power, the same forms of power, and that affects all of us on the planet. So the difference between escaping the Roman Empire and escaping empire with a capital E that we all exist today is that there's no outside. We're going to have to create the outside from the inside.
Wow.
And that's difficult, right? We can't escape. There's no example. So this is why I think it's so important that we start with our minds, because that's the place where we actually have the most power. And I have to be very careful when I say that, because very often well-being or individualism presents, or let's say that efforts and movements for liberation and revolution, when they are presented as an individual thing, that's usually to disarm them and to remove the collective power that a revolutionary movement has. So it's packaged to you as well-being, like things like yoga, for instance. It's presented to us in the West as this individual thing that you do on yourself, and they've completely removed the entire connection to nature, but to
the
also
tribal aspect of it. Yes.
Yeah, the community aspect, the collective aspect, and the political aspect of it. So I've done a whole video essay about how to survive the collapse of empire and of society, and talking about divesting from empire. And that divesting, it's mostly psychological, it's political, it's religious, all of the ways in which we can start with ourselves to divest, to emotionally disconnect from empire. But that must not be understood as a way to escape.
Like checking out. It's not checking out.
Checking out. And that doesn't mean that in the meantime, we don't also try to do collective action to collectively come up with a society. And that might involve some level of violence, that might involve. So none of what I could say about decoloniality, and because I do focus on the individual, that is not to be understood as an excuse to not do the rest of the work that other people might be focusing on. Do everything that they say. I may not be the best organizer. So when it comes to organizing policies and like taking collective actions, I'm happy to follow. I'm not necessarily the best organizers, but I want to contribute in ways in which we can remove empire from ourselves. So that leads us to what you were saying earlier. That leads us to learning to stop worshipping power, because I think that this is the most fundamental thing that defines coloniality and that defines the society that we live in. We're still, even when we think we're the most liberated and we're the most revolutionary, many of us, I find still, and myself included, of course, it's an ongoing work, but I always have to expunge, get rid of this sort of worshipping power. What does power worshipping look like, even among progressive or leftist or whatever? It's for instance, taking pride in let's say African kings and queens. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but I'm simply saying that in the context where pride has been denied to people, I completely understand that there's a reappropriation of our history. That's one step, and that's one necessary step. And I will not take that away from anybody. If your road to loving yourself, to accepting yourself, and to being proud of yourself, your identity, your history, if that goes via learning about the African kings and queens and the empires that existed in Africa, go for it. That is a necessary step. However, I think that we also still need to go beyond that. And why would I not take pride in my potential Black ancestors who were sweeping the floor, who were just tending to their field? Why is it that I only can define myself by some powerful tyrant that has existed in the past? And so that can be very difficult, again, in the context where our identity has been systemically, historically denied. Then suddenly you hear me and I'm like, oh yeah, that's problematic that you admire those kings and queens. So I understand that there are stages, right? And just because I focus on a different stage doesn't mean that I want to invalidate the other stages. But I think it's important that we are aware that this is a journey, and that the journey doesn't stop at, oh, I finally can reconnect to power. Because either because we have access to power, we gain knowledge of existing power, that's a great thing, but that's not the end of the journey. I believe that the end of the journey is to stop worshipping power in all its forms. And that means going to therapy as well, because that's not something that you get to very easily. And yeah, that means rethinking the way that we relate to others, the way that we relate to nature. And I'm not saying that it's easy, but at least it's easier than overturning the US government at the moment for an individual. So we can start there.
So I like where you've taken us, because you're the way I'm thinking of it is, the way I'm conceptualizing it is, you're talking about mindset and memory. So mindset, like, we have to stop thinking about stop worshiping power, stop worshiping some of the systems. But we also have to think about memory in the sense of collective memory, because we see there's a big push around burning books, changing content within museums, challenging what gets posted in libraries and in schools, what people can talk about. And so, the sense of, if you can disconnect a person or people from their history, from their collective memory, you can then say, this is who you really are, versus this is where you come from, whether you're the farmer or you're the king, or somewhere in between, or somewhere beyond either one of those. You're sort of detaching people, detaching populations, detaching communities from their collective memory. And where both of you have me thinking about is wealth. Is, Melanie, you mentioned, people have to think about getting a job and have to support themselves. And then Joris, what you're talking about reminds me of a conversation we had several episodes ago around reparations. And that particular guest was talking about wealth. And he defined it not just in terms of money, but in terms of having cultural autonomy, having access to good healthcare, access to good food, being able to relate to people and relate to bodies in a way that is different from how we do it now, but that involves a level of personal autonomy, so that you can relate to people and relate to bodies as you would like. And so, it's interesting to hear how these are sort of coming together and attaching and connecting to some of our previous conversations. Just where my mind is sort of going right now.
And I think it's important to recognize that in the society that we live in right now, the closest I can hope to get to something that vaguely resembles freedom is through wealth. It's not my choice, but I have to still operate under the system that I exist in. And Melanie, when you were talking about, we still need to have a job, we still need to do those things. So I think it's important that we work with the conditions that we have. We can do the prep work of preparing our minds to start thinking, imagining, because the colonization that begins with imagination. So starting to imagine a world that is different, that doesn't rely on power worshipping. That, meanwhile, we still have to survive. We still have to go to work. We still have to survive in an oppressive system to avoid the police, ICE, all of those things. So, but what we can do immediately is start preparing ourselves by divesting from the worship of wealth. And that doesn't mean that, I don't like money. Yes, I would very much like to have money. I would very much like to own a house. I would very much like those things, even though my work is to challenge the notion of ownership to begin with. But in the system that I exist in, this is the only tool that I have, and I have to work with it. So there's no denying of that. And I don't want anyone to feel bad for wanting to live comfortably, for wanting nice things in life. Nobody's taking that away from you. And Derek, you were sort of rephrasing by saying that we need to stop worshipping power. And I know that this is how I may come across, but I would never say that people need to stop doing this or that. What I aspire to is that we get ourselves to a point where it's no longer relevant.
Yes.
But if you still need it at the stage that you're at on your journey to liberation, me taking it away from you, that would be violence. That would not get us any closer to liberation. That would mean me refusing you access, or me preventing you for doing anything or for dreaming. That would be violence. So I am also not in favor of that. I hope that together I can take you to a place where you tell me, do you know what? Yeah, I don't care about about, luxury and wealth and all that. But that's your journey, and it's not like I shouldn't be trying to push you there. I hope that we can get there together, but that's the best I can do.
This is nuts. This is so, Derek, I'm sure you're thinking this too, reminding me of our conversation with Siddhartha, where that entire episode was an exercise for me in loosening my grip on that desire for that upward thrust. And what would it be like if I loosened the grip, if I was comfortable enough inside myself, if I could feel free enough to let myself feel like I'm in free fall, right? Because I keep thinking as you speak, Joris, the premise of this podcast for Derek and me, right? Blacklining in reference to turning on its head the historic structures and practices that kept Black people from developing wealth by way of owning property, having mortgages, and so on, decades ago, really 100 years ago. And we're still seeing the impact of that in the huge, vast and increasing discrepancy in wealth between, let's say, Black people and white people in the United States. And the other part of our title of our podcast name is Wealth, Power, and Land. And so I'm listening to you and I'm like, right, we had this vision of like, oh, we can have conversations about how we access power. And that was a stage for us. And then we found ourselves falling fairly quickly into deconstructing the desire for power, even though absolutely we want to have things. But what we're doing in this podcast is reckoning with the cost, the trade-offs, and more clearly seeing the difference between the things and us, and what's possible if us becomes more of a collective. What then happens? We might start desiring something entirely different.
Yeah. And power, we live in a society where power matters. So it's impossible. We cannot completely detach ourselves from power in a society where we need power to exist, right? So again, that's the acknowledgement that we have to navigate the society that we live in, and there's no denial of that. There's no denying of that. And I think that there's the good example of Black capitalism, which was sold to many of us as this would be the liberation of Black people. Liberation would go via capitalism, which conveniently completely erases all of the history of anti-capitalism and Marxism and revolutionary thinkers, like the Black Panther Party. I think that's the second point of their manifesto that was clearly stating we are anti-capitalism, and that's been swept away by the CIA. That was an intentional. That's a very frustrating thing, because they won. They got it. Like the power, the white people, the CIA. They got what they needed from Black people. They've removed the dangerous thing, and they kept the aesthetics of liberation or aspiring to liberation by giving us Black capitalism. But today, I do not consider as my enemy a Black person who still buys into that dream. I think they're mistaken, and I think that it is my job to hopefully show them how there are other things to aspire to, or at the very least how capitalism will not liberate us. But however, I have an issue with the Black capitalists who have won the game of capitalism and who are still selling it to us, the Beyoncés, the Jay-Z, those people, because those they know where their interests lie. They know who they are in community with, and it's not us. It's not the other Black people at the bottom of society, but it's still presented as they're the example. Though they are the people to follow. I I went on a tangent there. I don't remember where I was.
It was a great tangent. I was like, "Ooh, you taking it there?" I mean,
Yeah.
Beyonce and Jay-Z are everywhere, so I'm like, I
was
wouldn't
like,
touch that.
Derek is liking
Auntie
this.
Oprah might be coming for you on a helicopter. Who knows? But I did want to ask you one last question, because I know we're getting close to time. In the work that you do you see a difference in how people relate to decoloniality or indigeneity between those folks who are in the former colonial core, so Portugal, Spain, France, Britain, and those who are in the former colonies? Because I imagine if you're in a former colony, you actually have people, communities who were colonized who are still there. If you're in the core, you may not ever come into contact with them, and they're not such an established part of the society. So how do you see people responding differently, if at all, to what you're presenting?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because there is a difference. I think that there is an understanding in the periphery of empire, in the colonized world. I call it like that, not because I think it's great, but because sometimes I think it's important to name the power dynamics. And where there's an oppressed, I think it's important to say it. So the colonized world, there is curiosity, because I think that there's already this general understanding and awareness that there is a colonial exploitation happening, and that even though it may take different forms, but there's still a general system that tends to benefit the global north and exploit the global south. So even in Guadeloupe, which in many aspects is completely French, so it's still like it's one of the winners in a sense, in the sense that its proximity to the core of empire makes it benefit from coloniality in ways that other neighboring islands, for instance, don't necessarily do. But there is this understanding that colonization is still what shapes our society. What is very frustrating is that there isn't this understanding in the core of empire. And what coloniality says is that coloniality doesn't only affect the colonized, but it affects the colonizer. Yeah. Because in order to dehumanize someone else, I need to have undergone a process of dehumanization myself. Yeah. If I understand and if I see myself as a human being part of a greater, bigger thing, I cannot dehumanize you. So in order to dehumanize, I need to have already been through the process of dehumanization myself. Now, I'm not saying that, oh, the poor colonizers, they're the victims too. That's not what I'm saying. They are victims of their own system, but that doesn't excuse it, or that doesn't take away their responsibility for having colonized the world, right? But it is a system that is affecting everyone and that everyone is suffering from, not to the same extent, but white people aren't well either. You know, they're not fine. They're suffering. They don't know why, and they take it out on the other people more oppressed than them. So they rely on white supremacy. They rely on racism. They rely on all of those systems that already exist. But the more they try to, like, you know, get a hit, it's like a drug. Yeah, it's addiction. It's like an addiction, right? Yeah. Because they're struggling more and more to get that hit of, I think, like, feeling good.
Dopamine might be the word you're going for. Dopamine.
Pardon? Dopamine. Yeah. But they keep trying. They are desperate because they don't get that hit of feeling like, you know, society works for them.
Yeah, feeling okay.
So and of course, what do they do first? They go to the things that is the most readily available, which is the systems of power that they can benefit from. So that means racism, that means fascism, and all of those things. But of course, it's still not hitting the way they want it to hit. So we get into this vicious cycle. And if there was an awareness of coloniality and the fact that you've been lied to, you've been exploited to, white people, your connection to the land is also broken. You need to reconnect. You need to, obviously that's not going to be our job. We're not going to do it for them, because very often when we have this conversation, then they immediately turn to us and they're like, okay, show me, what do I do now? It's like, no, you figure yourself out. we have our liberation to take care of. But there needs to be this understanding that we are all affected, because again, coloniality is a global monoculture that we are all stuck in. And the huge majority of us, if we realize that we are in it, it's kind of like, you know, the fish doesn't know that it's in water.
Yeah.
We don't know that we are, most of us don't really know that we are in coloniality, but even less so the white people in Europe and the institutions. And that's frustrating because we need to get them on board too. But I don't see the same interest in this approach of decoloniality in Europe, in the UK, in France, not the same as what I get in the Caribbean, for instance.
Okay. I think we're going to have to hold there. And we may have to bring you back if you're willing, because I know that one of the things that you also talk about is the sociology of the built environment. So we spent a lot of the time talking about what's happening up here in the mind and perhaps a little bit in the heart. But we haven't talked about, and I started off talking about the physical environment, the walls, as a metaphor for all of this. But we haven't really spoken about the physical environment and how that still keeps us operating in certain systems, certain beliefs, and other patterns. So if you're willing, an audience, if we can get him, we'll try to get him back. So if you're willing, you know, we'll give you a call at some point and be like, hey, how about having this part of the conversation too?
Well, that's very interesting, because I'm working on a book, I'm working on a project, and for quite a few months I was stuck because I couldn't make the link between decoloniality that we talked about today and the sociology of the built environment, which is also my other favorite topic. And I think that I've recently just finally found the missing piece that connects the two. So this looks like a natural progression, and I'm more than happy to come back and discuss that with you.
I appreciate that. That'd be a hot take. Okay, you heard it here, audience. We're gonna get fresh ideas. All right. So thank you so much again for your time, for your knowledge, for your wisdom. We really, really appreciate it. It was a very rich conversation. And for those of you in the audience, if you have any questions or if you have any comments, feel free to post them on whatever platform you're on, and we'll be happy to respond. I'd love to get your feedback. Don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe. And we will see you the next time on the Black Lining Forum. Take care.
Bye-bye. Take care.